I'm really quite shocked about Zelensky. And I'm also amazed at how polite President Trump is being. He's been remarkably polite. The truth is, Zelensky's no longer relevant. He needs to shut up and get off the stage as quickly as possible. The longer he stays there, the higher the probability that he doesn't live long. He needs to understand that. He needs to stop listening to the British and the French, who are feeding him a lot of nonsense and have no chance whatsoever of helping him, especially that principal clown in the European circus, Boris Johnson, who is recently in Kiev again. Bojo from London isn't, and Macron in Paris is almost as irrelevant as Zelensky. It's unfortunate that we say that, but truthfully it is. He could have been much more relevant if he had taken a more strident position earlier against the stupidity, but he refuses to do that. So Trump is going to do whatever President Trump wants to do, and President Trump is not an enemy of Ukraine by any means, but he wants peace and stability in Europe, and he's going to deliver it. And I think Putin is going to help him deliver that. So I think at this stage of the game, Zelensky's irrelevant. It doesn't matter what he says or does. And the British and the French need to go home, and they need to tell their troops to stand down. They're not going anywhere. No one wants them anywhere, least of all the Russians in Ukraine. It's getting to the point where if you have nothing to put on the table, then shut up and get out. So I think this war will end when the Russians content and satisfied with what they've accomplished. I think those things will happen. It will all end. But the British and the French are living in a dream world. They're behaving as though they are great powers. They really aren't. They're middleweight powers at this point. They don't have much in the way of armed forces. That's not our fault. That's theirs. And they need to understand that. Once again, that's not President Trump's fault. That tragic outcome is a consequence of President Biden and these globalist fools that are still in power in places like Paris and London, and for that matter, even still in Berlin. And of course, Mark Rutte really needs to consider resigning. And if he feels very strongly about what he said, he should volunteer his services, get on a uniform, pick up a weapon, fly to Kiev, and offer his services in the front lines. I don't see that happening, but that's what he ought to do, because what he's just said is just pure, unadulterated nonsense.
By the way, Trump has also said some great things about China recently. He said he wants to disengage our naval forces from the South China Sea. He's sending signals about withdrawing forces from Northeast Asia. He wants to disengage most of our forces from Europe, not because he wants to abandon Europe. He would like to sit back and support Europe as Europe sorts itself out. That, to me, is a breath of fresh air, because we've had for 50, 60 years nothing but four-star Army and Air Force generals trying to tell the Europeans how to do everything, or various secretary generals who have been pathetic puppets of Washington. He's saying, let's end that. I mean, that's where we're headed. I think it's all good. It's how it's packaged and presented that makes a big difference. And I don't think we've packaged it all that well. But in our system, the people that donate huge quantities of money have to be adhered to some extent. You have to grant them their wishes. And he's had a lot of people who've demanded from him that Israel have a free hand, not only in Gaza, but to annex the West Bank. And the Israelis are now pursuing that. And if you look at the patches that they're wearing on their arms in the IDF, it shows you this Greater Israel Project. And that controls everything from southern Syria all the way to the west bank of the Nile River and all of Sinai and so forth. Well, that presumes, Neil, that he had the opportunity to pick those people without interference from outside actors. In other words, he has donors, people that donated enormous quantities of money that were instrumental in putting him in the White House. He has to deal with them. He brought in John Bolton as a national security advisor, and I know that he didn't want the man, but he received a call from Sheldon Adelson, who was his biggest donor at the time, and said, please, won't you talk to John Bolton? I know he'll do a good job for you. And finally, he relented and met with the man. It was an unhappy marriage from day one. He never liked it at all. I don't know how much he can obstruct that. Now, Israel on its own can't do anything. Let's be frank. The only reason they can do what they do is because of our unconditional support. And they know that. And they've never had it so good. Will that continue, or will he finally say, wait a minute, this is too much? Other presidents have always stood up and said, stop. There have to be limits to how far you go and what you do. That hasn't happened. And I don't know if it will happen. I can't predict that. I just don't know. I only know the man Trump. I regard him as innately good, but I am disappointed in some of these transactional attitudes, particularly the callous disregard for life in Gaza and potentially elsewhere. If you want to do business with me and you bring me a bag of money, then I'll consider your request. This kind of thing disturbs me greatly. It can't go on like that, and we can't survive as a great power with that philosophical approach. And as I said again, if Donald Trump can act on his instincts, everything will be fine. And right now, I don't know if you saw it recently, but President Erdogan was talking to an audience of young Turks, and they began chanting, "Take us to Jerusalem, take us to Jerusalem, take us to Jerusalem." Remember that the Turkish Sultan, was the first Khalifa of Islam, and the holy city and all of the sites there were under his protection. You've had statements coming out of Israel suggesting that the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which marks the place or commemorates the place from which the prophet's soul ascended into heaven, should be destroyed so that this new temple can be built. This is, I'm not involved with this. It's not my way of looking at the world. But in that part of the world, that's incendiary. And the Turks in particular are opposed to it. And finally, to get them to stop, he motioned, please stop. And then he said, patience will deliver victory. And this is another challenge for us in the United States, because we have seen ourselves as the principal driver of events and activities. Remember this stupid remark, we're the indispensable superpower. In reality, we don't need to be involved in very much at all. And I think that's something that Mr. Trump understands. But in the Middle East in particular, the Turks are a great people. They have a very martial culture. There are somewhere in the neighborhood of 80 plus million of them. They have a very large population under the age of 30. They can field powerful forces. Erdogan is nothing if not crafty and smart. I don't know how much longer he's going to be there. One of his likely successors is the foreign minister, Fidan. He's a very smart man. But the population is ready to act. That is nothing if not dangerous. The Arabs are worried about it. The Jordanians, the Egyptians, the Saudis, they are very worried about it. They all lived under Ottoman rule, and they had mixed experiences. So they're not especially happy about it, but increasingly, they are beginning to say, who else can lead us? Who else can save us? Who else can help us defeat this monster that has grown in Israel? And that's very dangerous. The other thing that I find kind of interesting with Mr. Starmer is that many, many years ago, back in the 1870s, Chancellor Otto von Bismarck was asked by a British journalist, what would you do if the British Army landed on the North Sea coast of Germany? And he said, well, that's simple. I'd have it arrested. And of course, his point was that the British Army was so small, it posed no real threat. Britain had a great navy, and that obviously could be threatening, especially if they were blockaded, which Bismarck understood. But I think, unfortunately, at this stage of the game, the British Army is emasculated to the point where no one takes it seriously. Starmer, I think, has embarrassed himself. And I'm sure Mr. Trump knows that. But the principal ice that's being broken is this hostility between Russia and the United States. For that, I think we should all be grateful. And from this point forward, we can move into a whole number of areas, not just resolving this tragedy on the ground in Ukraine, which frankly should never have happened. That's going to be resolved. But also we can get back to some useful discussions on nuclear weapons and nuclear capabilities. And I think Mr. Trump has already hinted at that. So all in all, this is good news. The question for President Trump is, how do you move ahead with the Europeans? I think that Mr. Trump has been subject to insults and offensive remarks, and I'm sure that continues to grate on him. But he does know that Europe has to play a role. How that's going to unfold, how that will be done is right now unanswered. You can't have a new security architecture in Europe that involves Russia and the United States unless the Europeans are involved. Now, I'm sure that there's an expectation that many of the people currently in power in Europe and in the United Kingdom will be gone shortly, that there will be elections and new people will be swept into power. Now, I don't know if that's necessarily anticipated in Great Britain, but it certainly is in Germany, and I suspect France and other countries. They are almost always nationalists, or certainly more nationalist in their thinking, which is not aggressive and offensive. It's a kind of nationalism that says we want to preserve our country. We want our own culture, our identity, our language. Those things need to be protected, and we want peace abroad. In other words, prosperity at home and peace abroad, which I think we all support. I certainly do, and I know the Russians do. That will work itself out.
I think that anybody that you boot out at this point is a good decision. You know, we're at the end of a long period of what I would call core rot in the Department of Defense. We've got large numbers of people at the top who have no business being there. They should never have been promoted to the ranks that they hold. The steady deterioration from excellence to mediocrity that I've been watching over the last 30 years is just astounding. And we have clearly bottomed out. So whatever Secretary Hegseth wants to change is good. I'm 100% behind it. The one criticism I would level is this. We don't want to rebuild anything, Dan. We want to build a new force. This is a strategic inflection point in the history of the United States. This is a time where we need to bring the forces back, and we need to retread, reorganize, retrench. That means organize for a different war in the future and pay attention to our security here at home, principally the border with Mexico, but not just that, the borders, the coastal waters. You know, it's back to bring the Coast Guard back from the South China Sea. Ridiculous. Bring the Coast Guard back from the Indian Ocean. Ridiculous. Get focused on what really counts, and that's defense of our homeland. That has been ignored for far too long. You know, one of the things that Secretary Hegseth and the new Secretary of the Navy ought to do is bring in a snapshot from the satellites regarding where all the ships at sea are in the United States Navy.